Today I will be teaching post-war changes in Korea. The liberation of Korea from Japanese rule was accompanied by its great national tragedy, the division of the country. Several developments during the closing days of the Second World War proved crucial in creating this division. Most important of these were the contingency of all the allies as war was coming to an end, the emerging rivalry between Soviet Union and United States, and the scattered and divided nature of Korean nationalist movement. The Korean provincial government, which had become virtually moribund by the mid-1920s, revived during Japan's invasion of China and had become closely associated with its sponsor, the nationalist regime. The nationalist regime of Chiang Kai-shek in Chongqing promoted the KPG. Chiang wanted a friendly, reliable and anti-communist independent Korea. In April 1942, Chongqing proposed that all the allies recognize the KPG as the government of Korea, but this was ignored by United States. Instead, in early 1943, British Foreign Secretary and President Roosevelt agreed that Manchuria and Taiwan would be returned to China and Korea would be placed under a trusteeship with China, the United States and one or two other countries. Later that year, when Chiang Kai-shek, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Churchill met in Cairo to discuss the future of Asia, they issued a communique on December 1st in which they stated that China, United States, Britain, mindful of enslavement of the people of Korea and determined that in due course Korea shall become free and independent. Roosevelt's plan was for a long trusteeship. Stalin appeared to have gone along with the plan of trusteeship at the Tehran conference, which followed the meeting at Cairo. Roosevelt's idea was for a 40 years tutelage, but this was reduced to 20 or 30 years at Yalta Conference. The Cairo Declaration was important because it was the first public statement on which allies were planning for Korea, while the idea of some sort of US and other allied power occupation of Korea had been for a long time. Part of the post-war settlement, the other division of Korea was a product of expediency. On August 6, 1945, United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and August 8, 1945, Soviet Union declared war against Japan. On August 9, the second atomic bomb was dropped at Nagasaki. This rush of events leading to the final surrender of Japan came with an unexpected suddenness. Urgently, the State of War Navy Coordinating Committee assigned Colonel Dean Rusk and Charles Bonnesteel on the night of August 9 and 10 to draw up a line for the occupation by Soviet Union and America forces. While Soviet forces were already entering the northeast of Korea, the closest American forces were 600 miles away and would not be able to reach Korea for several weeks. It was therefore urgent that the United States work out an agreement to prevent the entire peninsula from falling into Soviet hands. Rusk and Bonnesteel looked at their map and saw that 38th parallel split the country into equal halves, but kept Seoul in the southern half. They decided that was where to draw the line. It was important to note that the 38th parallel was an arbitrary line on the map and did not correspond to any geographical culture or historical division of the country. Korea had been a unified country since 7th century. No Korean had ever proposed a division of their land. Interestingly, outside powers had made similar proposals before. The Korean nationalist movement was divided ideologically, fractured, organizationally, and geographically dispersed. The communist movement in Korea had fallen victim of relentless and effective repression by the colonial government. Most of the communists had been killed, jailed, or driven underground. Outside Korea, the Korean's provincial government in Chungking had a small force of troops. This was known as the Korean Restoration Army. It had 3,000 or so resistance fighters who had geographically moved far away from Korea. After 1942, these Koreans were helping with USA military intelligence officials and advisors in China. There were some Korean exiles in United States. Most prominent was Singhamri, who spent the war in Washington promoting Korean independence among American officials. But none of these exile groups were regarded very seriously by the great powers, nor did they play much of a role in the events at the immediate end of the war. As these events were taking place abroad in Korea, the Japanese Governor General Abe Noyomki, aware of the gravity of the situation, began to look for prominent Koreans to work out some sort of post-war transition. The Emperor's August 5th radio announcement of Japan's surrender came to most Koreans as a shock, followed almost immediately by joyous celebration. It appears that almost all Koreans felt that independence was imminent. None suspected for an allied plan for trusteeship. Local people of all political persuasions met to plan for independence. In a little over 2 weeks, Koreans set up the People's Committee in every one of the country's 13 provinces as well. As local People's Committee in cities and countries, the speed by which they emerged suggested to some that there was a secret network throughout the country, perhaps led by the communists. On 6 September, several hundred delegates from the People's Committee met in Seoul and declared the Korean People's Republic. There had been some controversy over the exact nature of the Korean People's Republic. Both its name and the radical nature of its reforms suggest strong communist influence, although it is also seemed to represent a broader coalition of groups. Local People's Committee were organized throughout North Korea as they were in the southern area. On October 1945, Soviet created the North Korean Branch Bureau of the Korean Communist Party, still headquarters in Seoul. In December of that year, Kim Il-sung was appointed its chairman. Neither the Soviet nor the American had planned for occupation of Korea. Both began as military occupation without clear instruction and had both initially lacked Korean interpretation. However, Soviet occupation was orderly and well organized compared to the American occupation, which was marked by confusion of purpose, lack of preparation and planning, mixed signals from Washington, and the more open and chaotic politics of the South. By the late fall of South Korean political scene included the communists under the Pak Hong-yong, still hoping to work with non-communists to bring about an eventual socialist revolution. The conservatives of KDP, representing the landowners businessmen and wealthy elites, moderate leftists. Then there was US occupation authority, both fearing the spread of communism and looking for a moderate democratics with a political agenda comprehensible to and compatible for the Americans. Meanwhile, the Allied powers met at the Moscow Conference that began on December 27, 1945 to discuss the post-war settlement. There it was agreed that for a four-power trusteeship of United States, USSR, China and Britain would be set up for 4 to 5 years. This was a considerable and more realistic reduction from the earlier 20 or 30 years agreed to at the Yalta Conference. But it was still 4 to 5 years, too long for most Koreans of all political persuasions, who were still expecting immediate independence, were outraged at the news of a planned trusteeship. Massive demonstration took place with all major groups participating. Koreans were united in their position to the trusteeship idea. The unity of all Koreans in their opposition to the trusteeship was short-lived. The Soviet ordered the communists to support trusteeship. The North Korean Chong Man-sik, who criticized trusteeship, was removed from the office on January 4, 1946. At the conference, an American-Soviet commission was created to work out details of trusteeship. Before it met in March 1946, preliminary talks were held in Seoul in January. When the Joint Committee met in March, the Soviets refused to allow representatives of any organization that did not support the proposal of trusteeship to participate. By early 1946, the outlines of separate occupational zones with their own administration had already appeared. This was an unintended outcome of military occupation. No Koreans wanted or foresaw such a development, nor does it appear to have been the initial intention of either the USSR or the United States to create two separate states. In retrospect, it is clear that a communist regime was rapidly put in place in Soviet zone by the early 1946. There is no clear evidence that the Soviet Union had initially planned to create a separate state in their zone. Evidence suggests that Moscow entered the occupation unprepared and with no clear plan. The Soviets appeared to have been interested in the trusteeship and preferred to work through a national front government with the communists in the ultimate control. On February 8, 1946, the Soviet created a North Korean Provincial People's Committee to carry out the number of reforms. It was supposedly a broad coalition of all political groups, but in reality, it was dominated by the communists who were rapidly consolidating their control over the country. The Provincial People's Committee carried out nationalization of Japanese industry. The most important reform, the law on land reform, was enacted in March. It confiscated all lands owned by the Japanese and national traitors. The land reform addressed an important concern of millions of rural poor who made up majority of the country's population. Although there were not as much as large landlords in North, still it was a sweeping change. The regime carried out a number of important measures in spring and summer 1946, creating large-scale social organization that aimed at mobilizing women, peasants, bankers, workers and other groups that had previously little power in Korea and granting legal equality to women. The provincial government also announced universal primary education at the same time, movement across the border was restricted and rudiments of a defense force established. In the summer of 1946, the North Korean Branch Bureau of the Korean Communist Party, headed by Kim Il-sung, became the North Korean Workers' Party. It merged with another communist party, the Sin-Min-dang, made up of the Korean communists returning from China. In December 1946, a Korean National Democratic Front, consisting of all northern parties plus representatives of all southern workers' parties, was formed. Shortly afterward, election was held for local people's committee and the KNDF received 97% of the vote. This new government organized women, youth, labor, and intellectuals in support of a new social and economic order under the guidance of North Korean Workers' Party. Meanwhile, Soviet Union continued to promote Kim Il-sung as the leader. In October 1946, they named the university Kim Il-sung University. On February 14, 1946, a representative democratic council was formed with the intention of representing various points of view, but it was dominated by conservatives and little power. In August, USA MGIK announced plans to establish an interim legislative assembly. This had 90 members, 45 elected and 45 elected by the USA MGIK. Elections were held, but this was boycotted by leftists. Political problems were complicated by economic ones. Economic conditions in South were a major challenge. Inflation was a serious problem, undermining savings and adding to economic uncertainties. Industries were idle and unemployment was acute. To maintain law and order, USA MGIK created the Korean National Police. In January 1946, the USA MGIK created 25,000 members constabulary force, a paramilitary force that became the nucleus for South Korean army. To train officers, the USA MGIK established Korean Military Academy. The American-Soviet Joint Committee met again from April to July 1947 in another attempt to work out ways to cooperate and establish a unified independent Korea. The United Nations created an UN Temporary Committee on Korea, UNTCOK, to move the country towards independence. The UN plan was to hold election throughout the country, Korea, for a unified national assembly no later than March. Power would be transferred to this political authority. Soviet and American forces would be withdrawn and Korea would achieve their sovereignty. This plan seemed to have been doomed, since it was clear that two separate political systems were already taking shape on the peninsula. Thus, what came to be called the West North Korea and South Korea came to an end. To summarize, it seems that Japanese occupation of Korea was an important event in the history of Asia. The liberation of Korea from Japan were accompanied by the great national tragedy of that is the division of the country into two halves, that is North Korea and South Korea. After the Second World War came to an end with Japan's surrender, the great powers wanted to create trusteeship for Korea, which was actually not liked by most of the Koreans, and there were demonstrations and there were different type of activities going on in Korea. But ultimately it seems that the country did not accept the plan of trusteeship which the great powers wanted to bestow on Korea, and therefore they wanted to go for independence, complete independence. But the great powers were not in favor of complete independence initially, but later on, when they were thinking of complete independence of the peninsula, the country was divided into two halves, North and South Korea.